This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Exvangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. It's good to be back. I'm glad to be speaking to you again. I took most of the summer off because of some personal reasons, as well as just trying to think through what the real focus of this show should be moving forward. And it was a good time for me to just sort of rest and reset and reflect on what that might mean and what might be valuable to people that are leaving evangelicalism or have left evangelicalism and the broader public at large. And I wrote about this earlier in a not a podcast, but a blog post that I published earlier in September, just sort of detailing why I took that time off and what the new focus of the show will be. This show will always have stories of people who have left evangelicalism that seeks to validate and express their grief and their trauma and all of those parts of their experience and find validation and acceptance for their lived experience. But one of the things that I think I may have been remiss on in the past has been really to focus also on the sorts of triumphs that we can have after leaving evangelicalism. And that's something that I hope to be able to focus on in the future. Further, we do have an election coming up next year, and white evangelicalism is at its zenith right now. So it's very, very important to the broader public to understand why this population, why white evangelicals, and especially those in political power and cultural power, are so influential right now, and to understand the history of that particular movement and what that all entails. So my hope in the coming year is to really be able to focus on those two things, to be able to talk more clearly about the joys of finding purpose after evangelicalism, as well as detailing through conversations with people that do study evangelicalism or cover evangelicalism, and being able to contextualize that in a format that's easy to understand and access. And part of that includes the interview that you're going to hear right now with Professors Bradley Onishi and Daniel Miller. They are the co-hosts of the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And on their show, they really do a wonderful job of breaking down a lot of different elements of white evangelicalism through their episodes and through their interviews with other religious scholars. I highly recommend that you check it out. They are also both former evangelical pastors, so they bring both their lived experience as well as their professional all their professional rigor to the subject matter at hand, which is often white evangelicalism, which is the focus of their most current season, which you can find on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to the show. Finally, there is one other change to the show that I want to mention here up top, and this is something that I started thinking about at the end of 2018 and was hoping to roll out earlier, but alas, here we are. I want to build a form of economic reparations directly into the advertising business model of this show. So I'm going to begin selling advertising space for the show, but 55% of all funds earned from host-read ads on the show will be going through 2020 to nonprofits that support African American, Indigenous, and LGBTQ populations. If this is economically feasible, I hope to extend that into the future. My first announced launch partner is Brave Commons. They are an organization that seeks to elevate the voices of LGBTQ students working within and beyond Christian universities in the United States. Listeners may be familiar with this with this organization because I spoke to one of the co-executive directors, Erin Green, on a prior episode of the show discussing her work at Azusa Pacific University. They are a great organization, and I'm really, really happy to have them on board as a launch partner for this effort. But the hope is that through selling advertising, that is something that I can do to make this into a more financially feasible venture, as well as really put my money where my mouth is and say this is important and it's something that I'm going to do from the very beginning. This is not an afterthought. This is something that I will be doing in an effort to prioritize the things that I say I value, which include things like reparations or giving money to organizations that do laudable work with populations that are impacted by white evangelicalism's discrimination. So that is that particular information. So you may hear advertising later on in future episodes. That's not something that has happened before. But I do hope to make this work a bit more sustainable. And I'm just recording this from my home. I do have a day job and everything else. So that is part of the plan. You can send me questions or whatever at contact@exvangelicalpodcast.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and all those other fun places at BR Chastain. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at Exvangelicalpod. And you can join the Facebook group by searching for Exvangelical and answering the screener questions. All right, now let's get to this interview with Professors Bradley Onishi and Daniel Miller of the Straight White American Jesus podcast. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Exvangelical. My guests this week are the two co-hosts of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, Brad Onishi, who is Associate Professor of Religion at Skidmore College, and Dan Miller, Associate Professor of Religion at Landmark College. Welcome to the show, Brad and Dan.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you both for coming on. I've really enjoyed listening to your show and the way you sort of tackle white evangelicalism within the context of your show. But I want to start where we usually do, which is to learn a little bit about the guests and sort of where your story starts. You both are religion professors, so you sort of understand the value and importance of someone's early religious development. So, Brad, why don't you go first and talk a little bit about like your first religious experiences and what your introduction to evangelicalism or white evangelicalism was.
Yeah, so my story's a little different than others. I didn't grow up in a religious household, and by the time I was 13 and 14, I was kind of getting in trouble, kind of a punk kid. And I had a girlfriend who invited me to a youth group on a Wednesday night. And this was a classic way to get out of the house on a weekday, see my girlfriend on a weeknight, which in junior high is like impossible. There's no way mom can say no to somebody going to church. Mm-hmm. And, classic youth group story. She dumps me a week later, but by that time I am hooked on Jesus. And, within months I go from this sort of juvenile delinquent to hardcore Jesus freak. I go from, having mom drop me off at the movie theater and then sneaking around the back to do teenage stuff to standing out in front of the movie theater, asking people if they've heard of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Dan, how about you?
Yeah, so my family sort of church hopped some when I was younger. When I was a younger kid, tried out different churches and different things like that. But when I was 16, I think, maybe 15, 16, we were part of this church and this really, really small youth group, and they did like a 2-week mission trip to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And I went to that, and I had this kind of, you could call it a conversion experience, except that I was probably already converted, but this sort of, the evangelical term might be rededication, like sort of rededicating yourself to your faith and so forth. And that was sort of transformative for me. And I came back sort of fired up and gung-ho. And I was sort of the driving force behind a lot of the stuff in my family with religion then. Like my parents, I think, got a lot more serious about going to church. The 2 younger brothers who got really involved. And so I sort of traced the beginning of it really to that summer that I was 16.
Gotcha.
That's where I put the beginning for the most part.
Yeah. So you had sort of one of the terms that I heard on mission trips and things like that was mountaintop experiences. So that was sort of that mountaintop that you had that got you enthusiastic and on fire for God, as they say.
Yep. It was actually on that trip in that moment that I sort of came to the conclusion that I'd been called to ministry, as the evangelicals will say. So I came back with a vision of, becoming a pastor, becoming a minister, at the ripe old age of 16.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Big, right when you need to make big life decisions at 16.
That's right.
But, Dan, I just have to say, as an aside, I really appreciate that you say evangelical. I feel like I'm in the minority in saying evangelical, and most people say evangelical. But thank you for Team Evangelical. I appreciate that. But just getting back to this, I mean, I think it's really both your stories sort of reflect how much sort of youth culture had an influence in youth group culture on your introduction into evangelicalism. I mean, that sort of mirrors my life too. I was already a relatively religious oriented kid. I had just a lot of religiosity sort of swirling around in me. But I was sort of primed when my family moved from Indiana to the Chicago suburbs, and I didn't know any friends, and then didn't have any friends because I moved at the end of a school year. And then that next school year, I started a youth group, and bang, there it is.
Yep.
Yeah. So within your youth group experiences and things like that, were you also involved in or exposed to the sort of purity culture things that a lot of folks run into, especially usually like the 40 and younger cohort, but it's been there for longer than that too. But I feel like the 90s and early 2000s were the zenith of that focus. Did that intersect with your stories?
It does for me. I by the time I converted when I was 14, and by the time I was 15, I was wearing a purity ring. I had sort of been indoctrinated into all of the standard evangelical ideas about lust and sexual temptation and waiting until marriage and masturbation and all that stuff. And Josh Harris's book, was the sort of big thing. I Kissed Dating Goodbye. That was a big thing in our youth group. And so that played a huge role. I mean, and that was really a way, honestly, to signal to my old friends, my non-Christian, non-evangelical friends, just how drastically I had changed. When I got to school in 9th grade and I told them I was a Christian, they said, well, that's fine, great, whatever. And then when I told them, no, I'm not going to, do all these things that we used to do, and I'm not even going to kiss a girl until I'm married, right? And that's when they really sort of started to look at me like something really changed here. And I think that was a very clear outward signal to my peers that my life had been, transformed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, sort of similar. I think I'm just a little bit older than Brad, because I remember when I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out, I was somewhere in college. But yeah, I would have to look at the timeline. But you remember the True Love Waits, the little purity cards that everybody had,
and
there was that big event in DC where they put them all on the mall. I'm pretty sure that one of those was my card. I'm pretty sure that we sent our cards off, and somebody did that. We didn't go to DC, but yeah. So I mean, I grew up in Colorado. That's where I had this conversion experience and all of that. But then in the middle of my junior year in high school, we moved to Arkansas. So I moved to a really different kind of evangelical religious culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it was down there that, it was just sort of part of your faith that you're going to wait until you're married to have sex. And I was, I never even sort of questioned that. Again, in terms of parents and stuff, you've got all kinds of teenagers whose parents are worried about them having sex. And I was the sort of driving force of saying, no, I'm going to wait till I'm married to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that was very much part of sort of that experience and how that played out for me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And for both of you, were you in non-denominational churches at the time, or were these, was there a denominational affiliation? I'll be honest, this is a leading question. And what I'm curious about is, I think I went to a United Methodist Church, where this youth group that was very formative for me, but everything really mirrored mirrored evangelical teachings, and I think it's because evangelical publishing houses were the ones that were providing content for those youth volunteers and youth pastors. So I'm curious if both of you had similar experiences, even if you grew up in or were exposed to different denominational practices.
Yeah, I think the answer is a clear yes. So I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in North Orange County, which is, it's on the border of LA County, but my church was a 2,000 person Quaker church, which sounds like a paradox. And when you think of Quaker, you kind of think of small gatherings. You think of kind of things that a lot of progressive people can get on board with. You think of social justice. You think of egalitarian structures. You think of a history of abolitionism. All of those things had been filtered out. And what had been sort of reworked was a very generic evangelical culture. So it was really hard to tell the difference between our Quaker church and something like, the Baptist church down the street, or the Methodist church down the street, or even the EV Free or the Vineyard. I mean, I had friends at school that went to all those churches, and there were some minor differences, but for the most part, we really had a common language. And as you said, Blake, a lot of that came from publishing houses, from tracts, from videos, from concerts. The Christian concert circuit really helped out with that kind of thing.
Right.
So
yeah.
That whole sort of, generic evangelicalism that kind of rode roughshod over denominational boundaries really hit home in my experience.
Yeah, mine's different. So when I was in Colorado, I was a member of a church affiliated with a denomination called the Conservative Baptists, which is a denomination of conservative Baptists. Like theologically, it's like the most, I guess, perfectly descriptive name ever. And then when I moved to Arkansas, I actually joined a Southern Baptist church. And so it was a really different experience. It wasn't a mega church. It wasn't, huge. I lived in this little town, and it was a church of a few hundred members, which in the little town I was in made it the biggest church. And it was huge compared to the church I had come from. I went from having a youth group with 8 or 10 kids to a youth group with 50 or 60 kids. And so that was a big deal for me, but it wasn't the same kind of experience. But it's interesting because it was a Southern Baptist church, the largest evangelical denomination in the U.S., was then, still is. But Brad highlights something when he talks about this kind of common vocabulary. It was the same thing. We would go to some big youth conference in Tulsa or Little Rock or wherever, and we would have churches of all different kinds, all different backgrounds, non-denominational, denominational. But there was this kind of common vocabulary and common language that all the kids would use, right? Everybody could talk the same ways, and they would talk about their walk, or they would talk about their quiet times, or they would talk about their purity pledges, or, they would have their purity rings, and everybody knew what that meant. And so I think it really did highlight the way that even within that denominational context, there were some sort of Southern Baptist distinctives, but there was that overlay of a kind of broader evangelical subcultural kind of ethos about it.
Yeah. Interesting. So moving on in your story a little bit, but for both of you, what sort of colleges do you decide to go to? Do you end up in Christian colleges, or where does your story sort of go next? And when do things we're at this point in your stories where you're still sort of in that on fire phase? When do you start to when did the questions start to creep in and you're not quite as sold on the whole endeavor? When does that begin?
So a bunch of formative things happened for me in the later years of high school. So I start dating my future wife when I'm a freshman in high school. As soon as I graduate, I go to Azusa Pacific University, which is half an hour from my house. Azusa Pacific is near Pasadena, California, and it's a sort of pretty hardcore evangelical place. We had chapel 3 times a week. That was mandatory. We had required Bible classes, required theology classes. But the significant thing that happened at the same time was, as soon as I graduated, I was a youth minister on staff at the church. So it was a big church, 2,000 people. I was one of the junior high ministers. And so now I'm in ministry. I'm at a Christian college, and I'm engaged to get married. And so by the time this my second year of college finishes, I become the head youth minister. I get married, and I continue to go to college. So by the time I always tell my students now, I know that you're having a hard time managing your assignments, but when I was your age, I was married and I was in charge of a 200 person youth group, and I was going to school full time. And so those first years of college were really the crescendo of my on fire phase. The problem was I majored in philosophy and took theology classes, and we all know that evangelicals are very wary of thinking too much in a philosophical way because it will lead you.
It's a slippery
slope, right? And they were right, because I really started to have intellectual crises starting in my junior and senior years, and by the time I finished, I was kind of at a crossroads.
It's interesting. There's some points of similarity and probably difference there. I was the same way. I went to a Southern Baptist college, and I majored in call it religion, but it was like, this kind of pre-seminary track sort of thing, and very much like Brad, my sort of on fire phase, if you like, persisted. But I also will say about my college, I was very intellectual there. I think there were a lot of students who were training for, they had a vision of like youth pastoring and stuff like that. And, and they kind of suffered their way through some of the more academic courses in like, the religion topics. I was, bigger into that. So I was a biblical languages major. I studied Greek and Hebrew, and learned to read the Bible in Greek and studied exegesis and things like that. And so for me, that was one of those kind of critical components, critical thinking. And I'll say that my faculty always encouraged me to think critically, and I never once had an experience of a faculty member trying to sort of rein me in or something. And so for me, it wasn't philosophy and theology, but it was like biblical study that started to like put some cracks in there. So on one hand, by the time I left there, I was still very much an evangelical, but within evangelical circles, I would have been something of a moderate in some ways. Like I affirmed the ordination of women, which sounds like nothing, and certainly doesn't mean much to me now. But at the time, that was a really big thing. And
certainly, yeah. In Southern Baptist circles, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I had some more moderate views on like the LGBTQ community. Of course, we didn't have that language then, right? But I didn't think that people chose to be gay. I still believe, because of purity culture and heteronormativity and stuff like that, that if somebody was gay, they were called by God to be celibate. But I didn't think that they were like wrong or sinful or bad for being gay, which again doesn't sound like a moderate position if you're outside of that world, but within it, it was pretty kind of edgy. And, I was not a biblical literalist because I'd studied the Bible too much in Greek and Hebrew and things like that. So it's very much in retrospect that I see those as sort of pieces that would sort of lead in a different direction later. At the time, I didn't experience them as sort of calling into question my evangelicalism, but I can see the pieces now in place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting that you mention like biblical languages being a sort of a vector, or like an entry vector for questioning biblical literalism, because that for me was a big thing. Also, I took 2 years of Greek in undergrad, and biblical literalism like doesn't survive modern biblical criticism. And just
even the biblical criticism, all you have to do is translate any passage from like one language to another, and you learn just how slippery language is, and that there's just no way that you can play this game of a one-to-one literal, literal translation and all that stuff. There's just no way. It just doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. But both of those are, I think sort of. I don't know. Within our world of people that have left evangelicalism, it sometimes feels cliche, right? You like educate your way out of evangelicalism,
right?
In a way. So you sort of both have these experiences, but then I've listened to some of your shows, so I know that there's other parts of the story. You both are pastors at different points. that I'm sure I'm sure adds another level of pressure as far as feeling an obligation to believe certain things and then a duty to teach them and live them. So what was that part of your experience like for each of you when you feel like you're moving away from this like faith of origin to something different, but you're also in charge of shepherding people and that sort of thing. So how does that affect you?
Yeah, that weighed on me tremendously. As a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, when I graduated college, my denomination wanted me to go get a Master of Divinity. I sort of compromised and I signed up for the program, but I knew that I would only do 2 years and get an MA, and I would skip a lot of the pastoral and counseling stuff. And I was always in it for the books. I know I was going to study theology and philosophy. So, but as I went through that process, I battled two things, right? I know intellectually that I'm starting to really not line up with all the people around me. The books I'm reading on my days off are, theology and philosophy that I know they would think is out of bounds, that is not allowed. I'm thinking about social justice. I'm thinking about how I should vote. And on the other hand, my greatest joy in life was working with these teenagers. Like I'm helping teenagers who are having a hard time at home. I'm helping parents find their runaway kids. I'm helping kids who have drug problems. And so I don't necessarily want to leave them, even though it increasingly looks like I'm just not able to exist in this space myself. I'll say, I don't actually talk about this on our show very much, but I have a recurring dream still today. 15 years after leaving evangelicalism, I have this dream about once a month. And that dream is I'm up in front of 200 kids. I'm leading a prayer on a Sunday morning. And in my head, while I'm leading the prayer, I'm wondering if they can tell that I don't believe in God anymore. Right. And for me, that recurring dream is just a sort of signifier of like the paradoxical place that I was in for about a year. I actually ended up leaving. I went to the UK to go to grad school. And when I got to the UK, I thought, oh, man, I'm free. Like for the first time since I'm high school, I'm anonymous and I can actually search out the kind of Christian I want to be. What I didn't realize is very quickly, I was never going back. Like I got there and I thought, oh, maybe I'll be Methodist, maybe I'll be Anglican, maybe I'll be Orthodox. Who knows? It's a smorgasbord of denominations. I'm going to sample everything. And, if you fast forward 6 months later, I just can't get myself to go to church. It was a pretty quick exit once I actually left the geographical location.
Again, I guess there'll be some similarities and differences. And it's interesting. Brad and I really do have these weirdly parallel kind of stories in a lot of ways. I was thinking about this like in advance of this conversation, and I was thinking back around the timeline. So I graduated. I'm 22. I get ordained, and I go out to this church in Seattle, Southern Baptist Church, but it's in Seattle, which is this really progressive, largely secular city. And I had interned at the church the summer before, and they'd offered me a position for when I came back out. And so I'm one of two pastoral staff in this little church. It's called the associate pastor, which means I'm the junior of the two staff members. But if I look back on it, there are lots of, some people have these really rapid breaks, some of these more gradual breaks. Mine was much more of a gradual shift. But a really, really, really defining event for me was the 2000 presidential election. This is what I was thinking about earlier today. In my mind, that election was like really early in my tenure there. I think I was there for 5 years. In reality, I think I was halfway through my time there. But one of the things I realized, and Brad talked about the weight, the responsibility on him, is I didn't actually know much about politics at all. Because I had been in this evangelical context, and what I knew is Republicans are good and Democrats are bad, and we oppose abortion, and gay people, like their partners shouldn't have like insurance benefits. That was the big issue back then. that was all I knew. And I began to realize that I was like in this position where I thought I was supposed to be able to talk to parishioners about things. And like, if they would come to me with questions, I ought to be able to speak to them. And I was sort of ashamed that like I didn't actually know anything about politics. And so I did something that all the rationalist political like scientist people would think everybody does, but almost nobody does. I found this online website that had this whole list of like different political questions and, on a scale of 1 to 5, what do you think about this? And you could click on it. It would be what it, explain what that meant. I worked through this whole thing. It would match you to a candidate, right? And I come out like fully, like full on Democratic. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, it's like, some people have like, I don't know, a sexual awakening or something. Mine was this weird political thing where, like Brad's saying, that, social justice issues. I mean, I was still conservative by any measure in a lot of my views on marriage and abortion and things like that. But social justice and other things sort of were there. And I quietly voted for Al Gore in the 2000 election. And I'm in seminary at the time. And I remember the first time I go to the seminary right after the Supreme Court had sort of closed down the recounts in Florida. So the election goes to Bush and whatever. And I walk into like student lounge. It was this little tiny seminary campus. And all these people are in this prayer circle, right? And they're like praying and thanking God that like his will was done and Bush won and all of this. And I'm just kind of like, they invite me to join them. And I'm like, I begged off for some reason. And, I felt like this kind of outcast. But for me, from that moment on, it illustrated both that there were some things working in me that I hadn't realized, but it also sort of set me on a trajectory. I was still there when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and I wasn't in support of that. Being in Seattle, I got to know a lot more LGBTQ people, and they weren't what I had always thought they were, supposed to be. And so I also left to study in the UK, actually at the same college Brad went to. He came a little bit after I did. And when I left, I knew that I was done with evangelicalism. Like I had sort of boxed up all these thoughts and sort of stuck them in a shelf in the back of my mind. But when I left, I knew that I was done. And so again, maybe like Brad, a very sort of freeing feeling. I have remained more attached to the church, a version of church than Brad has, but a really similar experience in that. By the time I left, through a whole series of events and changes in what I thought, when I left, I was done, and I knew that I was done. I had felt this obligation to fulfill my ministry time there, and I had known for like a year and a half or so when I would be going to go to grad school, and I had sort of just, I don't know, made this bargain with myself or something that, I had been called to do this, and I would fulfill that, and to the best of my ability and my conscience, I would fulfill my ministerial obligations. But I was done, and I was. The day I left, I was finished with evangelicalism.
So you finished your duties, and then eventually both of you also work your way into academia. So what was it that made religion at least sticky enough for you to want it to be an aspect of your career, but just not a pastoral sort of vocation, but one of study and a more academic approach to understanding religion?
I used to think that this was kind of a contradiction in my biography. I used to think that, why is my life still consumed by religion when I've, by all accounts, left evangelicalism and I don't identify as a religious person any longer. Mm-hmm. And actually, when I think about it now, it makes a lot of sense. When I was 12, 13, 14, I was getting in trouble. I was kind of, giving my parents headaches. But I was also that kid who would go out at night and like stare at the stars and think about how life was meaningless. And this also explains why evangelicalism was so attractive to me. At an early age, I kind of felt a nihilistic impulse inside of me. Like, what is the meaning of life? It seems like it's kind of, temporary and then you die. I mean, what's the point? And evangelicalism provided very neat answers to that. Yeah. I mean, looking back, very sophomoric answers, very, in many ways, intellectually dishonest answers, but answers nonetheless that I cling to until I was in my 20s. Well, when I emerged from evangelicalism, I remained somebody who was absolutely obsessed with asking fundamental questions. I just didn't want to do that in the kind of intellectually closed and fundamentalist community that I had been ensconced in throughout my youth. So in that way, I think it makes sense. Like, I remain fascinated by life's most primary questions, and I love studying and interacting with the people who are asking and answering those questions, even if I'm just not somebody who identifies as a Christian or as a religious person at this point in his life.
Mm-hmm. Dan, how about you?
Yeah, it's again, there'll be some similarities there. It's kind of funny. I was thinking about the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has this place, and I'm not going to remember exactly which text he says this in, but where he kind of says that Christianity, in his view, sowed the seeds of its own downfall because it emphasized truth so much, and he's sort of like, in his mocky Nietzschean way, is like, Jesus said you'll know the truth, and the Christians took it really seriously, and they went out and they sought the truth, and it undermined their faith. And there's a certain sense in which I went but I went to study theology, right? So I was leaving evangelicalism. I wasn't leaving Christianity. I didn't think I wasn't leaving the church. So I went to study systematic theology. That opened up a whole other set of questions and very, very different conceptions, as Brad says, of like fundamental issues, right? Even whether theistically conceived or not. But so part of it on just the academic side, I wound up sort of shifting from biblical studies to theology to eventually more of a philosophical approach. And then the person I was working with was in a religious studies program. And I sort of, over time, I sort of evolved into that. But along with that, for a while, I was active with the church when I lived in Oxford. And then I came out to the States, and for a while I was kind of drifting out. It wasn't that important to me. Started having kids and, just didn't have much time. Ironically, bringing it up more to the present, part of what has sort of moved me back to a liberal, progressive kind of church has been the Trump election. It turns out that when I hear all these evangelicals talking about, the we ought to be opposing, asylum seekers and refugees and this and that, the sort of, another philosopher, Richard Rorty, would call it your kind of final vocabulary, like my bedrock, the place where I reach, in the moments of rage and that sort of thing, is this passage where Jesus says, whatever you've done for the least of these, right? The hungry, the widow, the orphan. It's this very, very much a prophetic kind of Jewish passage in one of the Gospels. You've done for me, that the locus of the divine, however you define that, is in the marginalized and dispossessed. And I just found myself sort of almost thrown back into that in opposition to a certain kind of Christian ethno-nationalism that feels like it's sort of gripping the country. So I feel like I've kind of become almost drawn back into a form of religiosity, in part as a response to what has been going on with, white evangelicalism in the last few years.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an understandable impulse. We left our final sort of evangelical oriented church in 2014. It was one of those things where we stayed because of the community. Like, had never considered myself evangelical for a long time, even before that, but we stayed because we loved the people, which is what a lot of people feel. But then we were unchurched for a couple of years until the election, and then we tried out an Episcopal church after that. So yeah, that does make sense, and it actually that provides a really good segue, I think, to talking about the show that you both started last year. I believe it was last year, right? In 2018. Yeah. Was when you launched the first season of Straight White American Jesus. You're both co-hosts of that show, and what you do there is you really tackle these things a lot of times from a topical sort of approach, and you've even for season 2, you even dialed in even more on white evangelicalism and really talking about that. So you mentioned the Trump election. I actually started my show. It launched the same week as the Republican National Convention in 2016, which
Wow.
which was intentional because of the evangelical connection to the GOP, and sort of in hindsight was just almost prophetic or fortuitous or something. But one of the things that I really like about your show is that you contextualize what it means for white evangelicalism in particular to be not just a type of religion, but also a culture. So if either of you could sort of start that, I'd like to sort of enter that part of the conversation, just talking about what that means for American culture right now in particular, that and understanding white evangelicalism not only as a religion but also a culture.
I think one of the first pieces to talk about is this qualifier white evangelicalism. There are lots of ways that people define evangelicalism, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds of that because it's pretty boring unless you're really into it, like geeks like me.
We can talk about Bevington if you want. I mean,
right. Well, I mean, yeah.
It.
So
No.
there's a
Brad says no.
there's a habit that I mean, one of the things Brad and I talk a lot about is people tend to define religion a lot in terms of belief, right? And one of the ways of defining evangelicalism is in a set of beliefs. And if you go to like the website of the National Association of Evangelicals, they have Bevington's list of like, here are some beliefs that if you're an evangelical, you believe these things. And if you just go by that, we know that, majority African-American denominations and congregations, if they're polled, will state a lot of the same beliefs that white evangelicals do. And so, and you'll often see evangelicals cite this to show that the movement is diverse and that it involves lots of different kinds of people. But if you were, a traveler from somewhere and was like, oh, here's this diverse form of Christianity, I'm going to go explore it on a Sunday morning, and you walk into a church, it's going to be really predominantly white or really predominantly black or really predominantly Hispanic. It's not going to be, this kind of mix of people. And so what we also find is that if you define evangelicalism and you put that, you say, okay, well, let's control for the variable of racial or ethnic identity, all of a sudden, all kinds of patterns emerge, right? If somebody tells me I oppose abortion and I oppose same-sex marriage and I go to church 4 times a month, how do you think I voted in the election? I don't necessarily know. If they tell me I oppose same-sex marriage, I oppose abortion, I attend church 4 times a month, and I'm African American, how do you think I voted? I'm almost certain they didn't vote for Donald Trump. And if they're white, they almost certainly did, right? High levels of religiosity, conservative religious beliefs, that the race or ethnicity is that key idea. And because of the really highly segregated nature of most denominations and churches, that's part. So that all of that to say, that's one of the pieces we wanted to look at, and I think has come through really clearly in the things that we've done. It's come through in my work and my teaching, and you just more and more scholarship has come out since 2016 in particular, highlighting that racial component is a really, really, really central feature of this form of American religion, right? So I mean, that'd be the sort of first thing I would start with, is just why that focus, because people want to know that, right? Why always white evangelicalism? What's that qualifier doing there? And I think that it's a really, really important qualifier for understanding what's going on, because Trump didn't win 81% of the vote of everybody who opposes abortion. He won 81% of the vote of white evangelicals who oppose abortion. Those African American Christians, by and large, didn't vote for him, and that's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brad, you want to jump in?
I think what's important to me when we try to get beyond belief to culture is that beliefs are often a cover. So as Dan just outlined, you can poll people, and many folks across racial and ethnic lines are going to line up similarly on a survey. However, when you investigate their lived experience, their culture at their church and their communities, they're often drastically different. And so I think for us on the show, we want to we want to dissect how beliefs, if I talk about family values or if I talk about a culture of life, what I'm telling you to your face is that, yeah, I'm opposed to abortion, or I'm for protecting the nuclear family, or something like that. What I'm getting beyond that, though, is much, much more. So beliefs are a cover for a whole package of things that are actually often more important, even if they're often more or less salient than the beliefs, right? So evangelicals will talk your ear off about a culture of life. They will talk your ear off, right, about family values. What they won't sort of fess up to is what kinds of moral quietism, what kinds of fatalism, what kinds of racism, what kinds of exclusionary practices that those beliefs enable for them. And so for us on the show, I think that's really important, is we need to get beyond, giving evangelicals the benefit of the doubt and dissecting their beliefs. And we need to see what those beliefs are doing for them to understand why someone like Donald Trump looks so close to Jesus in their eyes.
Right.
Yeah. Sort of. I was just going to sort of dovetail on that theme of going beyond belief. This is also why, I was invited to. Somebody had heard the podcast, and I was invited to do this. Just sort of there's an informal get together of progressive UCC, United Church of Christ pastors near where I live in Central Mass, and they're just really curious about this phenomenon of evangelicalism. And one of the things that Brad and I felt like we brought in the podcast is both this kind of insider view of having been in evangelicalism, but also the critical tools of the professional, academic study of religion and so forth. Mm-hmm. And they would say things to me like, okay, I get, like they would say, I don't agree with it, but I get opposition to abortion. I see how that could be cast as a religious or moral issue. I don't agree with it, but I understand why, especially given the history of Christianity, they would oppose same-sex marriage. But what about gun rights? I don't get, like, they're biblical literalists. Why in the world do they think, this way about gun rights? And why do they think the things they think about refugees when there are all these commands in the Bible about loving the marginalized and the poor and the orphan and the widow and so forth? And what part of what even motivated this season in thinking about these things for us was that if you focus on that level of belief, those are completely incongruous and they don't make any sense.
Right.
But exactly as Brad is saying, if all of these things come together as a kind of, a package deal, and if, as I've argued in places and we argue on the show, if politically conservative identity is a part of the religious identity of a majority of white evangelicals, then to be Christian is to be politically conservative, which means to be Christian is, yes, to oppose abortion, yes, to oppose same-sex marriage, but also to affirm a certain interpretation of the Second Amendment, also to have a certain notion, of what national security is, or whatever other kind of buzzwords you want on the political right. And it's only when you can, as the language Brad's using, is you get beyond belief to see what do those beliefs bring with them, what do they do for the evangelicals socially, how do they help to maintain and construct evangelical identity. That's when you can start to make sense of these kind of phenomena in a way that a focus on theological doctrine doesn't. It just sort of misses all of that.
Mm-hmm. And one of the lenses that you have used in the show is to talk about evangelicalism as a form of fundamentalism, and being fundamentalist both in its sort of understanding of key biblical texts, but them also having a very particular sociopolitical interpretation, right? So, I mean, you can have a liberal Christian look at the first two chapters of Genesis and have them be motivated by that text to preserve the earth and respond to climate change in this moment in history.
Right.
You will have, within evangelicalism, you will have people pushing back and saying that no, Genesis 1, I think 28 says that we're supposed to have dominion, and so we can do whatever the hell we want with this earth. And, God won't let the carbon get imbalanced. Don't worry about that, So that's just one particular example of fundamentalism, and it being, as you both said, like a package deal. What is it? how else can that, looking at it from that lens and that understanding of what it means for white evangelicalism to be a fundamentalist culture and religion, how can people that are outside of it use that to understand both the motivations and the reasoning behind evangelical political behavior?
So I think there's a pretty quick response, right? Fundamentalists of all stripes interpret themselves as the true believers or the true citizens. Mm-hmm. They construct a memory, not a history, though they may call it that. They construct a memory of the past that places them at the center of the story as the true restorative people in a religious tradition or in a country. Now, when it comes to white evangelicals, they get to be both. They're the true Americans and the true Christians. The impulse of the fundamentalist is first and foremost to reduce the world to a binary. Us and them, here and there, me and other. And my argument is that evangelicalism is a culture that protects those who want to reduce the world in those terms. So we can take that in terms of gender, right? We can talk about the evangelical resistance to recognizing trans people, evangelical resistance to having conversations and dialogue about gender and sexuality being on a spectrum. We can talk about immigrants. We can get to a place where evangelicals will say, whether or not we're all God's people is one thing, but we are Americans and we are the chosen people in this country. And so those refugees who came here illegally, sorry, I have no pity for them. So fundamentalism at its core wants to divide the world into two categories, place good over one, evil over the other, and then go from there. One of the things that evangelicals love about Donald Trump is that this is his impulse, first and foremost, on every issue. And so why not Ted Cruz? Why not Mike Huckabee? Well, because in a way that was similar to George Bush, they might have shown a little bit too much willingness to actually reflect on the complexity of certain issues. That's saying a lot when it comes to George W. Bush, but when you compare him to Donald Trump, evangelicals find there, right, a will to power and a will to reduction that is so seductive. It is exactly what they want. And so if you go at it in that way, it makes perfect sense that he is their guy, he remains their guy, and until he turns on them on fundamental issues, he will always be their guy.
Yeah. Everything Brad said is, I think, exactly right. And just to sort of add to it or to sort of pick up on some points where he sort of touched on, I think you do have this radical simplification of everything into an either or category, right? Exactly as he's saying, into binaries. But you also have, I think, it's sort of mixed into that, but you can have different versions of that. But you also have, with this sense of, maybe that's even what you see in like biblical literalism, right? It's either all literally true exactly as God intended it and said it, or it's all false. You can't trust any of it. There couldn't be anything in between, right? But when you take that kind of model of absolutes of good or evil and truth and falsity, and you blend those together, you have a potent mix. And I don't think it's unique to religious fundamentalism. I think you get similar things in certain like fascist ideologies and so forth. But when you have, as Brad says, the sort of will to power, a legitimation of power that can be benevolent because it's grounded in truth, right? You can have a full affirmation of power at any cost because this power must be good, right? It must be beneficial. God wouldn't bring somebody to power if it wasn't somehow for the benefit of everybody. You weld that to an apocalyptic vision of an ultimate cataclysmic conflict between God and God's enemies. And I think you have a recipe for exactly the kind of authoritarianism that you find. You have somebody like Trump who is, as Brad said, he's like the walking id of that binary reduction of everything.
Absolutely.
And a radical simplification.
Oh, for sure.
But you have it. I just read today that Tony Perkins, Family Research Council guy, has a new book coming out, and apparently they changed the title, but the original title was "Render Unto God and Trump." And it's this book that is slated to come out, and that's a reference to Matthew, the render unto God what's God's and to Caesar what's Caesar's. It was slated to come out right in front of the 2020 election, and saying that evangelicals have a moral, theological, spiritual obligation to stand with Trump, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in a lot of ways he is like the embodiment of all of these kind of visceral feelings that I think are central to fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
It might be Ralph Reed. I'm not sure it's Tony Perkins.
Oh, I think you're right. My apologies. Yeah.
No, we'll have to
Sorry.
check it. But...
Sorry, Tony Perkins. I can't believe I have to say that, but
Well, I
sorry,
mean,
Tony Perkins.
let's not give him any benefit of the doubt. I mean, he's the guy who said that we should give him a mulligan. You know,
This is why I like having text in front of me, right? Because then I the wrong name. But yeah, no, thanks. But yeah, it's one of those figures. But that when I read that title, I was floored, right? Like I don't know, just the crass, as you say, the sort of will to power. I mean, it's almost unbelievable if it wasn't all too believable.
Yeah, and I when I read things like that, I get the same sort of impulse as you mentioned earlier, Dan, of like being driven back to, okay, wait, hold on, you're using this, you say you're Christian, you, like, Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jewish rabbi, and like he was resisting empire, like throughout most of his ministry, and Jesus did have expectations of loyalty, but when it comes to governmental power, like it's pretty clear that he wasn't a big fan.
Yep.
And
right.
The interesting thing I think as well too is that the expectation of fealty to the government does not extend to any Democratic candidate within evangelicalism. Jeff Sessions can quote Romans 13 when he's trying to justify locking children in cages and other terrible injustices. But for Democrats to do that would be unthinkable for more than one reason. But
yeah.
In light of how much sort of power white evangelicals have, influential white evangelicals have, it certainly feels over the last few years that they are at their political zenith. There are definitely a lot of organizations that have worked a long time quietly, building influence, and they are certainly striking while the iron is hot during the Trump administration. For both of you, how do you feel about the way in which media covers and portrays these types of stories? Do you think that they are doing a serviceable job? Do you think that they are missing key aspects of motivations of this evangelical base or the leaders? Really, what are your thoughts as far as, I mean, we're about to go into high gear with the 2020 election as there's an active impeachment inquiry too. So evangelical leaders are definitely not going to be backing off. Who was it? Robert Jeffress is already, he's already intimating that there will be civil war if Trump is impeached. So clearly these folks have sway, and they are not going down without a fight. So what is your take on how things are being covered in the broader media right now?
I think there's kind of two divergent directions, and we're going to have to see what happens. For me, the 2016 election was a moment when a larger portion of the American populace woke up to the fact that giving the benefit of the doubt to white evangelicals was a bad idea. That their presentation of themselves as the true Americans who are hardworking Midwestern or Southerners, who, are rural folks who, own guns, pay their taxes, and work hard, and they're just, the real true folks. I think a lot of folks woke up to the idea that we need to stop giving them the benefit of the doubt and stop sort of letting them craft their own image. However, with all of that said, it's clear to me that there are still many writers at important outlets who do just that. That, in their sort of effort to, get more coverage for the religion beat and to preserve journalistic balance, there's a kind of willingness, I think, to use kid gloves still. Blake, one of the reasons I was, so thankful for deconstructing my religion with you and Chrissy and Liz Kinnicky and everyone else who was involved was, to me, that signaled one of the first times that I saw in a mainstream outlet a willingness to take a sharp and critical eye at the toxic aspects of evangelical culture, sexually, politically, et cetera. To me, that was a landmark moment that honestly, I'm not sure we'd had before, right? And that's what I mean by divergent. I think in some ways we have folks in academia, certainly in the journalistic domain for sure, that are waking up to the fact that we need more of that kind of incisive analysis. On the other hand, it's hard to break through. As you said, the century-long influence that has been built up by this group. I'll also say they are the best at crafting an image, mobilizing their people, and getting them to vote. They're not a growing, they're at their zenith, but they're not a growing group. And yet it feels like, one of the first episodes we did was, what is an evangelical and why are they running my life? Because it feels like
right.
They're running the country, even though they're a small, aging, portion.
It's like a quarter of the population.
And it feels like they're everywhere. And every time we do something, we have to ask for their permission, So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, to just pick up on some of the same themes, I think one overarching theme that the media is confronting with this is the same thing they've been confronting, as Brad says, since even before the election, which is this phenomenon that they have, and they talk about it. You hear this openly discussed by media outlets of the obligation to cover news that's happening, right? And when certain people speak, you have to cover it. And yet they have this dilemma, like when Trump stands up and says a bunch of stuff that isn't true, and they're sort of caught in this dilemma of, well, do we not report on what the president of the United States is saying, right? If it means that we're the echo chamber that like amplifies falsehoods and whatever. And I think the media, the broadly mainstream media, has had to confront that question in a way that they probably haven't before. I think evangelicalism is a piece of that, right? So I think on one hand, you've had more kind of critical reflection on those kinds of things. I think in the same way that more and more media outlets are beginning to say, we can't play that, right? We're about reporting, but we are about reporting facts and things that are true. And so they're getting more critical. But I think you have all those other things that Brad is talking about. And I think another one is for years and years and years, you have had, and this is one of those things where the right they've just been really media savvy, and they've been much better at it for a lot longer than the political left has, of pitching this idea of the liberal media, right? And that the liberal media, liberal bias, and and so you get this almost knee-jerk reaction in media now to present two sides of things, even if there really kind of aren't two sides of things, right? If there's 99% of people think one thing, but like there's one outlier, they feel like they have to present it. And you get some of that, I think, in the kind of religion and culture kind of thing, that you do have this group that is 23% of the population, according to Pew, or something like that. But every time something happens, even if you have like a mass population or scientific facts on your side, there's this need to be, well, yeah, but we need to give equal voice to the alternative viewpoint. Even if the alternative viewpoint doesn't weigh as heavily, is not nearly as influential or as widespread. And so it helps perpetuate that sense that this movement is speaking for more people than it is, that it is more socially significant in terms of numbers than it is, that it is more representative of the U.S. population as a whole than it is, because you're always going to have the talking head to represent the religious right or the conservative evangelicals along with somebody else. Mm-hmm. So I think the media has my sympathies kind of go out to the media, right? It's easy to beat up on the media, but I have no idea how if you're a media outlet, how you navigate this right now, this notion of we need to report on what's happening and what people are saying, but when we know that they're saying things that are false, how do you not perpetuate that. But I
Right.
think that all of that is tied together right now.
I totally agree with your last statement in regards to it being very difficult to cover these things, and part of that I think is everyone's more sensitive to it because of the way in which social media is also criticized for the way it moves and influences sentiment and all, and seems to make us much more reactive than we may have been in the past. One of the things I'm also curious about is what ways do you think the work that religious studies and academia can really benefit those sorts of media outlets when they're covering things? Because one thing that even just studying things on my own for my master's degree and everything, and moving from an evangelical school to where a lot of things just weren't covered to a more liberal school where I just had access to more ideas and more books and that sort of thing. I was sort of shocked to learn just how deep the literature is in regards to the study of evangelicalism, the criticism of evangelicalism from all sorts of different angles, whether it's gender or sexuality or politics or some other intersectional sort of play on that. That seems to just go back decades and be very, very deep. What can that sort of academic work do to really help the more general populace understand and develop a more nuanced understanding of white evangelicalism and its political and social force in America right now?
For me, this question came up because when the 2016 election happened, I had just switched schools. I had gone from teaching in Memphis, Tennessee, to teaching in upstate New York. In Memphis, a lot of my students were either evangelical or they had been exposed to evangelicalism growing up. In upstate New York, many of my students were secular or they identified as Jewish. And what I realized when I got to New York is that for those students, the evangelical, the conservative religious person was like an exotic species. It was someone that they'd never met. I actually started assigning visitation trips where they had to go to an evangelical church and come back and write a report. And I actually turned into someone who I never expected to be, and that was trying to complexify and add layers to the character of the evangelical so that my students would get past this idea that they were just irrational, non-thinking, completely biased, closed-minded, terrible human beings. With that said, my goal is not to, as an academic or a scholar, to defend evangelicalism, but my goal is to say what we need to do is become religiously literate. We need to be able to understand white evangelicals in their humanity. Now, don't get me wrong. That does not mean agreeing. That does not mean agreeing to disagree. What that means is saying, like we've been saying all season, if we can get beyond belief to passion, to emotion, to affect, to vulnerability, to culture, then we can understand how people think themselves and live themselves into these positions, whether that's on abortion, whether that's on guns, whether it's on climate denial, whether that's on Trump. And so, for me as a religious studies scholar who's an ex-evangelical, my goal is always to say religious literacy is not about a sort of like blithe compassion. And it's also not about studying exotic animals like people are sort of something to gawk at, right? What it's about is getting to a place where we're willing to engage and encounter religious traditions and communities like white evangelicals so that we can come to a better understanding of how to respond to them. Now, sometimes when we engage religions, we have a transformative and very positive encounter. Whether or not that means conversion is beyond the pale, but we might come across and say, wow, I learned something about my world and myself from them in a way I never expected. We also might have a sense of horror. We might have a sense of repugnance. And we might have we can transform those feelings into action. We can transform those feelings into activism in ways that I think are much more informed and organized if we're willing to take the time to sort of investigate those religious traditions in very complex ways. Now, for the ex-evangelical, I would say, if you want to study the literature that you're referencing, Blake, it's important, because what you come to understand when you study that literature is that you are not out of bounds for thinking that your experiences were really, really, really beyond the pale, that they in many ways might have been toxic or authoritarian or abusive or anything else. When you read that literature, it really helps your sense of perspective. Like, you get a bird's eye view of, I really was in a very peculiar and a very sort of fringe movement in many ways that I'm trying to recover from, that I'm trying to sort of like rebalance myself now that I'm out of it. For me, that literature is actually helpful for saying, I'm going from a lived experience to an outsider's view, and it's actually helpful because I can sort of see myself in that movement from a detached perspective and get a better view of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think just to pick up on some of those, I think one of the aims we've had with the podcast, and one of my favorite parts of it, right, has been the interviews that we've had with academics from different backgrounds, different approaches, different disciplines. Because one of the things that happens in academia, right, is, I mean, you really are you're working on really complex ideas, and you develop specialized vocabularies for that, and you have the luxury of getting to spend time doing that and to talk to people about that, but it can become very insular, right? And I don't know very many academics who wouldn't like the stuff that they spend their lives developing to be better known outside the academy. And so it's just our small way, I think, of trying to get some of that really, really good work into more of the mainstream, or into to a broader popular audience. And so, the interviews that people have, I think, our own efforts to try to talk to, an audience who aren't all trained academics. Because I think you're right. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. And I confront this with my students all the time, where I'll say something and they'll give me this look, and I'm like, I'm not making this up. I can give you like a stack of
right.
of sources, right? That, I can give you, it's like math homework. I can show my work. I can show you where I'm getting this, and I can show you where the social scientists have done all this survey work, and they've shown that, this isn't just a supposition. But it's hard to get out there. It's hard to get out because it isn't easy, right? It doesn't naturally lend itself to sound bites. It often adds complexity, right? We talked about the media, and one of the questions that sort of arises is, I think, a media culpability in reducing things to either ors, or to simple, either a both and or an either or, but really simple bite-sized pieces of information. When I tell my students all the time, any question worth asking, any problem worth addressing is worth asking or addressing, because it's really complicated and it's really complex. So I think anything that people like you and hopefully Brad and I and the people that we've had on the podcast and other people who are doing these things, I think that's a really vital role of trying to form sort of a bridge between that kind of what can be kind of esoteric material and a kind of simplistic sort of popular conception, either pro-evangelical or anti-evangelical or, whatever. And that's part of what Brad and I wanted to do with the podcast, is give a perspective that understands. I think we can present, like, here's what it's like within that evangelical context. Here's what they're kind of thinking and feeling when these things happen, but in a way that can also be critical of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that about your show. I really appreciate that you both lend this personal lived experience as well as this well-developed academic understanding of your subject matter. And I think it's great that you're putting it out there in an accessible format. Obviously, I'm a fan of podcasts. We're talking on one right now, and I think it's the best medium with which to really try to tackle and contextualize these complicated sorts of things. And so I really think what you're doing with Straight White American Jesus is very laudable. And I think it's great how you're selecting these scholars with very well-developed expertise, but that their work has, I think, just a enhanced social relevance in this sort of moment in history, because of the things that we've been talking about, the amount of power that this group, that we all have been a part of, and now spend our time still thinking about, even though we're doing it from the other side. That means something, and I think what you're doing on the show is really, really great in surfacing those topics and that content. So I wanted to make sure I said that, and encourage you both to keep doing it, because it's great, and I'm glad that there are scholars out there putting their work out in such an accessible way.
We appreciate that.
Yeah. I do want to add, and this is just for all those evangelicals out there that in ways that would horrify our elders, Dan and I got together in Northampton, Mass, where close to where he lives, and we took a walk on a sort of rainy spring day, and we were talking about doing this thing, and we went to Jonathan Edwards Church, which is now the church that Dan attends, and it's a very welcoming and affirming church. A huge rainbow flag greets you as you sort of walk up to it. We then hatched the details for the podcast at a predominantly lesbian bar in Amherst, Mass. And so the origin story of the podcast is as horrifying to our evangelical others as one might imagine. So.
As it should be. So kudos to you on that.
Yeah.
If we could have just worked some more dancing in there, I think we might have scandalized the Baptists more. Sort of.
I'm sure somebody was dancing in the bar, right? Just maybe not. Maybe not the two of you.
Dancing leads to podcasting, is what I learned.
That's right.
Oh man. I wonder if my alma mater, Indiana Wesleyan, has any rules against podcasting now.
Yeah.
Anyways, well, I want to thank you both for coming on the show and talking to me a little bit about both your stories as well as your work on your show. Where can people find either of you online, as well as where can they find your podcast together?
So we are Straight White American Jesus is where, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find us. Stitcher, Apple Podcast, Google. I am on Twitter at Bradley Onishi. We have our Straight White American Jesus Facebook page, and you can email both of us. What am I missing, Dan?
Nothing except the fact that I'm not on Twitter because I just don't know if my mental health can handle it. So I've sort of
just don't. It's okay.
But if people want to find me, I mean, I'm if you just Google Daniel Miller Landmark College, that's where I'm at. I'll pop up, and my email and contact information is there, and I love to hear from people. And I'm with Brad. We check and follow the Facebook page and the posts and different things like that. So people can find us if they want to, and we'd love to hear from them.
Great. Brad, Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Blake. We really appreciate it.